The cloak arrived at her stall just after midnight, draped over the arm of a tall figure whose white skin seemed to glow under the single flickering street lamp, and Juniper Kane knew immediately that accepting it would change everything. She'd been packing up her rickety sewing table outside the all-night laundromat on 5th Street, the only place in the city where someone like her could still make a few dollars mending clothes for shift workers and insomniacs. The figure stepped from the shadows so silently that she gasped, her hand flying to her chest as she stumbled backward against her folding chair. "Forgive the intrusion," the man said, his voice like silk pulled over steel. His hair was white as fresh snow, long enough to brush his shoulders, and his eyes were the color of dark wine held up to candlelight. He wore clothes that looked like they cost more than she'd make in 5 years, all black velvet and silver threading, but the cloak he carried was torn nearly in half, a jagged rip running from collar to hem. "I was told you work with fabric." Juniper swallowed hard, unable to look away from his face. He was beautiful in a way that made her chest ache, all sharp angles and aristocratic features. But there was something profoundly wrong about him. His skin was too pale, too perfect, and when he breathed, she couldn't hear it. Her grandmother's warnings echoed in her mind, stories told by firelight about the creatures that walked the night, the ones who ruled from their hidden courts beneath the city. Vampire. Yes, she managed, forcing herself to focus on the cloak rather than his face. The fabric was exquisite, some kind of silk she'd never seen before, midnight blue that seemed to shift purple in the light. The tear looked deliberate, like something had slashed through it with claws. "I can mend it? Name your price." He held it out to her, and she noticed his hands were steady, elegant, with long fingers that looked like they'd never done manual labor. Juniper took the cloak carefully, running her fingers along the tier. It would be difficult work, requiring tiny stitches and careful matching of the fabric's grain, but she could do it. She'd been sewing since she was 6 years old, first with her grandmother, and then alone after the old woman passed. It was the only skill she had, the only thing that kept her from complete destitution. She looked up at him, at this impossible, beautiful creature who'd sought her out in the middle of the night, and made a decision that came from exhaustion and something deeper, something like defiance. "No charge," she said quietly. "I'll do it for free." His expression shifted, surprise flickering across those perfect features. "Free?" "Yes." She folded the cloak over her arm, feeling the weight of the silk. "You can pick it up tomorrow night. Same time." For a long moment, he simply stared at her, his dark eyes searching her face as if trying to understand a puzzle. Then he inclined his head in a gesture that seemed to belong to another century. "Very well. Tomorrow night." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows between street lamps so completely that Juniper wondered if she'd imagined the whole encounter. But the cloak was real in her hands, heavy and cool and smelling faintly of something she couldn't identify, something old and rich and dangerous. She carried it home to her tiny studio apartment above a closed bookstore, laid it carefully on her narrow bed, and began to work. The tear was worse than she'd initially thought, the edges frayed in places where whatever had ripped it had pulled at the threads. She worked with her smallest needle and silk thread she'd been saving for something special, matching the color as closely as she could under her single lamp. Hours passed. Her back ached, her fingers cramped, but she kept going, driven by something she couldn't name. Outside her window, the city gradually woke up, dawn breaking over the buildings in shades of pink and gold. Juniper finally finished as the sun climbed higher, her eyes burning with fatigue. The mend was nearly invisible, the stitches so small and precise that you'd have to know where to look to find them. She hung the cloak on her door and fell into bed, asleep before her head hit the pillow. When she woke 12 hours later, the sun was setting again, painting her apartment in shades of orange and red. Juniper ate a quick dinner of instant noodles, braided her long brown hair, and headed back to her usual spot with the cloak wrapped carefully in clean muslin. He was already waiting when she arrived, standing in the exact same place as the night before, looking like he'd stepped out of a painting. Tonight he wore a different coat, this one charcoal gray with silver buttons, but the effect was the same. Wealth, power, and something otherworldly. "You came," Juniper said, trying to keep her voice steady as she unwrapped the cloak. "Did you doubt I would?" He took the garment from her, his cool fingers brushing hers for just a moment. The touch sent a shiver up her arm, though his skin wasn't quite cold, just absent of warmth. He examined the mend closely, turning the fabric this way and that under the streetlight, and something changed in his expression. Surprise again, but deeper this time, mixed with what might have been admiration. "This is exceptional work." "Thank you," Juniper said, suddenly shy under his scrutiny. He draped the cloak over his shoulders with a fluid motion, fastening it at his throat with a silver clasp shaped like a wolf's head. The fabric settled around him perfectly, the mend completely invisible now that it was being worn. "You refused payment." "I did." "Why?" The question was direct, his dark eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed. Juniper thought about lying, about giving him some noble reason, but something about his gaze demanded honesty. "Because you looked like you expected me to demand a fortune, and I'm tired of being predictable. Because I wanted to do something that wasn't about survival for once. Because the work matters more than the money." A slow smile spread across his face, transforming it from merely beautiful to absolutely devastating. "What is your name?" "Juniper Kane." "Juniper," he repeated like he was tasting the word. "I am Lucien Gravesend, and you, Juniper Kane, have done something no one else has managed in 300 years. "What's that?" Surprised me. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small card, cream-colored and embossed with silver lettering. "If you ever need anything at all, you need only ask." He pressed the card into her hand, his fingers lingering for a moment longer than necessary, and then he was gone again, vanishing into the night like smoke. Juniper looked down at the card. It had a name, Lucien Gravesend, and an address in the oldest part of the city, the section where the buildings dated back 2 centuries and the streets still had cobblestones. She tucked it into her pocket and tried to forget about him, tried to return to her normal life of mending torn hems and replacing buttons. But over the next few weeks she found herself thinking about him constantly, about his white hair and wine-dark eyes, about the way he'd looked at her like she mattered, like she was more than just another struggling seamstress trying to survive in an indifferent city. Strange things started happening. Her landlord, who'd been threatening to raise her rent, suddenly decided to lower it instead. The laundromat owner gave her permission to set up inside when the weather turned cold. People started coming to her stall specifically, saying they'd heard she did the best work in the city, bringing her more business than she'd ever had before. And sometimes, late at night when she was walking home alone, she'd catch a glimpse of white hair in the shadows, feel eyes watching her with protective intensity. He never approached her again, but she knew he was there, this vampire king who'd somehow decided she was worth guarding. 2 months after their first meeting, everything fell apart. Juniper was working late, finishing a rush job on a wedding dress, when 3 men surrounded her stall. They were human, she could tell that immediately, but there was something wrong about them. Their eyes were too bright, their movements too coordinated, and they stank of desperation and dark magic. "You're the seamstress," the tallest one said. He had a scar running down his left cheek and teeth that had been filed to points. "The one the vampire king favors." Her heart hammered against her ribs. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie." He grabbed her arm, his grip bruising. "We've been watching you. We've seen him. You're going to give him a message for us." "I don't know any vampire king," Juniper insisted, trying to pull away. The other 2 men closed in, blocking any escape route. "Then you'll learn," Scarface said, and pulled out a knife. Juniper screamed, loud and piercing, as the blade flashed toward her, but it never connected. One moment the man was there, knife raised, and the next he was gone, torn away from her with such force that he flew backward into the wall of the laundromat. Lucien stood where Scarface had been, and he was terrifying. His eyes had gone completely black, no white visible at all, and his lips were pulled back from his teeth, revealing fangs that looked sharp enough to tear through steel. He moved like lightning, like death itself, faster than Juniper's eyes could follow. The other 2 men tried to run, but they didn't make it 3 steps. Lucien caught them both, one in each hand, and slammed them together with a sickening crack. They crumpled to the ground, unconscious or dead, she couldn't tell which. Scarface was trying to crawl away, blood streaming from his nose. Lucien walked toward him slowly, each step deliberate and predatory. "You touched her," he said, and his voice had changed, deeper now, resonating with power that made the air vibrate. You threatened her." "We were just sending a message," the man babbled, terror written across his face. "The Blood Court wants you to know they're coming. They don't accept your rule anymore. They're going to—" Lucien grabbed him by the throat, lifting him off the ground one-handed. "If anyone touches her again, if anyone even looks at her wrong, I will burn the Blood Court to ashes and salt the earth where it stood. Am I understood?" Scarface managed a strangled nod. Lucien dropped him, and the man scrambled away, leaving his unconscious companions behind in his haste to escape. Then Lucien turned to Juniper, and the terrifying darkness faded from his expression, replaced by concern. His eyes returned to their normal wine red, his fangs retracted, and he crossed to her in 3 quick strides. "Are you hurt?" Juniper shook her head, not trusting her voice. Her whole body was trembling, adrenaline crashing through her system. She'd known what he was intellectually, but seeing him move with that inhuman speed and strength, was entirely different. "You're shaking." Lucien shrugged off his coat and draped it around her shoulders. It was the cloak she'd mended, she realized, the one he'd worn every night since. He'd kept his word. He'd never worn another's work again. "I need to get you somewhere safe." "Safe from what?" Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. "Who were those men? What's the Blood Court?" Lucien's jaw tightened. "Enemies, rivals, vampires who believe I've grown too powerful, who want to challenge my position. They know hurting you would hurt me, so they tried to use you as a message." "Why would hurting me hurt you?" Juniper asked, though part of her already knew the answer, had known it since that first night when he'd looked at her like she was something precious. He met her eyes, and she saw something vulnerable in his expression, something that contradicted his regal bearing and ancient power. "Because in 300 years of existence, you're the first person who's treated me like I was more than a title or a source of fear. You mended my cloak and refused payment, refused to treat me like a transaction. You gave me something freely, expecting nothing in return, and that kind of genuine goodness is so rare that He paused, seeming to struggle with words. "I find I cannot stop thinking about you, cannot stop watching over you, cannot imagine allowing harm to come to you." Juniper's breath caught. "You've been protecting me." "Yes." "The landlord, the business, all of it?" "Yes." He didn't look apologetic. "I know I should have asked permission, should have stayed away, but I couldn't. You did something kind for a monster, and it meant more than you could possibly understand." "You're not a monster," Juniper said. And she was surprised to find she meant it. Yes, he was dangerous. Yes, he was capable of violence. But he'd used that violence to protect her. And the way he'd looked when he'd thought she was hurt, that was real emotion, real concern. Monsters don't spend 2 months making sure a seamstress has enough business to eat. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Most people would disagree with you. Most people are idiots." She pulled his cloak tighter around herself, breathing in the scent of him, that same ancient richness she'd noticed the first night. "What happens now? Will they come after me again?" "Not if you're under my official protection," Lucien said. "But that would require you to come with me, to stay in my home until this is resolved. The Blood Court is powerful, but they won't attack my residence directly. It would be open war, and they're not quite ready for that yet." Juniper looked around at her little stall, her sewing machine and folding table, the life she'd built from nothing. It wasn't much, but it was hers, earned through endless hours of work and determination. The thought of leaving it made her chest ache, but the thought of staying, of waiting for those men or others like them to come back, was worse. "Okay," she said quietly. "I'll come with you." Relief flashed across Lucien's face. He offered her his arm like they were at a formal ball rather than standing in the wreckage of an attack. "Thank you for trusting me." She took his arm, feeling the solid strength of him beneath the expensive fabric of his shirt. "Thank you for saving me." They walked through the city streets, leaving the bright commercial areas behind and heading into the old district. The buildings here were different, Gothic and imposing, with iron gates and stone facades that had weathered centuries. Lucien led her to a massive structure that looked like it had once been a church, all pointed arches and stained glass windows, but had been converted into a private residence. Inside was even more impressive. The floors were polished marble, The ceiling soared 30 feet overhead with exposed wooden beams, and everywhere she looked there was art, furniture, and decoration that belonged in museums. It was beautiful and cold and utterly intimidating. "This is your home?" Juniper asked, her voice echoing slightly in the vast space. "One of them," Lucien said. "I have others, but this is my favorite. It reminds me of older times when things were simpler." A woman appeared from a side hallway, and Juniper nearly gasped. She was vampire too, that much was obvious from her white skin and hair, though hers was styled short and sharp around her face. She wore modern clothes, black pants, and a crimson blouse, and her eyes were pale silver. "My lord," the woman said, bowing her head slightly, "we heard there was an incident." "Morrigan," Lucien acknowledged. "This is Juniper Kane. She'll be staying with us as my personal guest. I want guards posted at all entrances, no one in or out without my explicit approval, and I want information on every blood court movement in the city." Morrigan's silver eyes slid to Juniper, assessing her with an intensity that made her want to squirm. "The human from the marketplace." "Yes." "The one you've been watching?" "Yes." Lucien's tone brooked no argument. "She is under my protection. Anyone who harms her answers to me personally." Something passed between them, some unspoken communication, and then Morrigan nodded. "Understood. I'll have a room prepared." She disappeared as silently as she'd arrived. Lucien turned back to Juniper, his expression softening. "Morrigan is my second, the captain of my guard. She's abrasive but trustworthy. If you need anything while I'm occupied, you can ask her." "Occupied with what?" Juniper asked. "With dealing with the blood court," Lucien said grimly. "They've made their move. Now I have to respond." Over the next week, Juniper learned what it meant to be in the eye of a supernatural storm. Lucien was gone most nights, attending meetings in places she wasn't allowed to follow, dealing with vampire politics that sounded Byzantine in their complexity. But during the day, when he had to retreat from the sun, he was there. And slowly, carefully, they began to know each other. She learned that he'd been turned during the reign of Queen Anne, that he'd once been the third son of a minor noble who'd made the mistake of impressing the wrong vampire. He'd fought his nature for the first 50 years, hating what he'd become, until he'd finally accepted that he could either embrace it or let it destroy him. So he'd embraced it, built power carefully and strategically, and eventually become what others called a king. He learned that she'd grown up poor, that her parents had died when she was young, leaving her with her grandmother who'd taught her to sew, that she'd always felt like she was invisible, just another struggling person in a city full of them, and that his attention was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying, because she didn't understand what she'd done to deserve it. "You were kind," Lucien said simply. They were sitting in his library, a massive room lined floor to ceiling with books, some of them so old the leather bindings were cracked and faded. "In a world that taught you to be mercenary, you chose generosity. That's rarer than you think." "It was just a cloak," Juniper protested. "It was never just a cloak." He reached across the small table between them, his cool fingers brushing her hand. "It was a choice. You could have demanded money you desperately needed, but you didn't. You saw someone who needed help, and you helped them, no conditions attached. Do you have any idea how long it's been since anyone did something for me without wanting something in return?" Juniper turned her hand over, letting their fingers intertwine. His skin was cool, but not unpleasant, smooth and strong. "Maybe people don't know what else you need." "What do you think I need?" His voice was low, intimate in the quiet of the library. She met his eyes, those beautiful wine-dark eyes that had haunted her thoughts for months. "The same thing everyone needs, to be seen, to matter to someone." Lucien's breath caught, an unnecessary gesture since he didn't need to breathe, but telling nonetheless. He stood, pulling her gently to her feet, and suddenly they were very close, only inches separating them. "You see me," he said softly. "Not the king, not the vampire, not the monster. Just me." "There's nothing just about you," Juniper whispered. Her heart was racing, her skin felt too hot, and she couldn't look away from his face. He lifted his free hand, cupping her cheek with a gentleness that contradicted his strength. "I want to kiss you. But I need you to understand what that means. I'm not human anymore, Juniper. My world is dangerous, full of politics and violence and darkness. If you let me kiss you, if you let this grow into what I think it could become, I won't be able to let you go." I'll protect you, provide for you, care for you with everything I am, but I'll also be possessive, territorial, and probably overbearing. You need to know that before you decide." Juniper should have been frightened, should have pulled away, thanked him for his honesty, and asked to return to her normal life. But standing there in his library, his hand on her face and his eyes full of desperate hope, she couldn't make herself want safety over this, over him. "Kiss me," she said. He did. It was gentle at first, his lips cool against hers, testing and careful. But when she made a soft sound of pleasure and pressed closer, the kiss deepened, his arm coming around her waist to pull her flush against him. He was strong in a way no human man could be, his body solid and immovable, but he held her like she was made of glass, like she was infinitely precious. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, her from need, him from habit, Lucien rested his forehead against hers. "You're mine now," he said, and there was satisfaction in his voice, possessive and complete. "I won't share you, won't let you go. If that frightens you, tell me now." "It doesn't frighten me," Juniper said honestly. "It probably should, but it doesn't." He smiled against her lips, kissing her again, and this time there was heat in it, promise of more. But he pulled back before he could go further, his control obviously hard won. "The blood court situation needs to be resolved first. I won't risk you while there's still a threat." "What are you going to do?" Juniper asked. His expression hardened, the king returning to replace the man who'd just kissed her breathless. "What I should have done months ago. Remind them why they fear me." The confrontation happened 3 nights later, in a place called the Crimson Hall, an ancient vampire gathering space beneath the city. Lucien insisted Juniper stay behind, protected by Morrigan and a dozen other guards, but he promised to return before dawn. Juniper paced the library for hours, unable to settle, imagining every terrible possibility. Vampires could be killed, she knew that much from stories. Stakes through the heart, beheading, sunlight. What if the blood court was stronger than Lucien thought? What if they'd laid a trap? What if she'd finally found something real and good, only to lose it to supernatural politics? Morrigan watched her pace with those unreadable silver eyes. "He's stronger than you think," the vampire woman said eventually. "I've served Lord Gravesend for 70 years. I've never seen him lose a direct confrontation." "There's a first time for everything," Juniper said tightly. "Not tonight," Morrigan's voice was certain. "He has too much to lose now. He has you." The words should have been comforting, but they just made Juniper more anxious. She didn't want to be a weakness, a vulnerability that enemies could exploit. But she didn't know how to be anything else, how to be strong enough to stand beside someone like Lucien without becoming a liability. Dawn was breaking outside, the first rays of sun painting the stained glass windows in brilliant colors when Lucien finally returned. Juniper heard the commotion in the entrance hall and ran, not caring about dignity or propriety, just needing to see him alive and whole. He stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the slowly brightening sky, and he looked like a king. His white hair was loose around his shoulders, his clothes were splattered with blood that she suspected wasn't his, and his expression was fierce and satisfied. When he saw her, his face transformed, softening into something tender. "It's done," he said. "The blood court is dissolved. Their leadership is dead, their followers scattered. You're safe." Juniper crossed the space between them and threw her arms around him, not caring about the blood or the watching guards. He caught her easily, lifting her off her feet and holding her tight against his chest. "I was so worried," she whispered against his neck. I know, I'm sorry." He carried her away from the entrance as the sun climbed higher, moving deeper into the residence where heavy curtains blocked out the dangerous light. "I would have come back sooner, but I had to be thorough. Had to make sure no one was left who might try to use you against me." He set her down in his private chambers, a room she hadn't seen before. It was surprisingly simple compared to the rest of the house, decorated in deep blues and grays, dominated by a massive bed with black silk sheets. No windows, she noticed, no way for sunlight to penetrate. "Are you hurt?" Juniper asked, reaching for him, needing to check for herself. Lucien caught her hands gently. "No, the blood isn't mine. But I need to clean up. I don't want you to see me like this, covered in evidence of what I am." "I know what you are," Juniper said firmly. I'm not some delicate flower who's going to faint because you fought to protect me. Let me help." Something in her tone must have convinced him, because he nodded and led her to an adjoining bathroom that was all white marble and gold fixtures. He stripped off his ruined shirt, revealing a torso that looked carved from pale stone, all lean muscle in perfect proportions. There were scars, she noticed, silvery lines that crisscrossed his skin, old wounds from before he was turned, still visible after 300 years. She wet a cloth and began cleaning the blood from his skin, her touch gentle but sure. He stood very still, watching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch, and she could feel the tension in him, the control he was exerting not to reach for her. "I killed 5 of them tonight," he said quietly. "Tore out throats, broke necks, burned one alive with magic I haven't used in decades. I did it without hesitation, without mercy, because they threatened you. Does that horrify you?" Juniper met his eyes, her hand stilling on his chest. "It should. But all I can think is that you're safe, that you came back to me, and that I don't have to be afraid anymore. Does that make me a bad person?" "No," Lucien said, his hand coming up to cup her face. "It makes you human. Humans have always been more comfortable with violence when it's in defense of something they care about. The difference is that you're honest about it." "I care about you," Juniper admitted. "I know it's fast, I know we barely know each other, but I care about you so much it scares me." "I love you," Lucien said simply. "I've loved you since you handed me back that cloak and asked for nothing in return. I've loved you through every moment of these past months, watching you work and laugh and live with such determination despite everything the world's thrown at you. I love your kindness and your strength and the way you look at me like I'm not something to fear. And if you'll let me, I'll spend the rest of your life showing you exactly how much." Tears pricked Juniper's eyes. "The rest of my life? You mean until I die and you go on without me?" His expression turned pained. "Yes, unless you choose otherwise. There are ways to extend human life, to slow aging. Not full transformation, but something in between. You could have centuries instead of decades. But that's a choice only you can make, and not one that needs to be made tonight." "Tonight I just need you to hold me," Juniper said. "Tomorrow we can figure out everything else." Lucien gathered her into his arms, lifting her easily and carrying her to the bed. They lay down together, her head on his chest, his arms wrapped securely around her. The position should have been uncomfortable given his lack of body heat, but somehow it wasn't. It just felt right, like she'd finally found the place she was meant to be. "Tell me about the first time you sewed something," Lucien said softly, his fingers tracing patterns on her back. So she did. And then he told her about the first time he'd seen the ocean, and she told him about her grandmother's stories, and he told her about the night he'd decided to stop running from what he was. They talked until the sun was high overhead, until Juniper's exhaustion finally pulled her under into sleep, safe and warm in the arms of the vampire king who loved her. The next few weeks were a strange adjustment period. Juniper moved her few belongings into Lucien's residence, setting up a sewing area in one of the spare rooms because she couldn't imagine not working. He offered her money, security, anything she wanted, but she insisted on maintaining her business, on keeping that part of herself that existed independent of him. He loved her for it. News spread through the supernatural community that Lord Gravesend had claimed a human woman, that he'd dissolved the blood court and killed its leadership over a threat to her safety. Some whispered that it was a sign of weakness, that love made him vulnerable. But most recognized it for what it was, a demonstration of power, a warning that anyone who touched what was his would face absolute destruction. Juniper learned to navigate his world slowly, meeting other vampires and supernatural creatures that she'd never known existed. Most treated her with respect born of fear of Lucien, but gradually some began to respect her for herself, for the way she spoke her mind and refused to be intimidated by things that would have sent most humans running. Morrigan became an unlikely friend, teaching her self-defense and vampire politics in equal measure. "You're good for him," the vampire woman said one afternoon while they were sparring. "He was becoming cold before you, too focused on power and control. You remind him how to be gentle." "He's always gentle with me," Juniper said, blocking a punch and countering with a kick that Morrigan easily avoided. "Exactly." Morrigan's smile was approving. "That's the point." 3 months after moving in, Juniper received an unexpected visitor. She was working on a commission, a wedding dress for a client who'd specifically sought her out, when one of the guards announced that someone was asking for her at the door. Someone human. She found a young woman waiting in the entrance hall, maybe 20 years old, with nervous eyes and a portfolio clutched to her chest. "Are you Juniper Kane?" the woman asked. "I am. Can I help you?" "My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm a designer, or trying to be, and I heard that you're the seamstress who works for Lord Gravesend. I was hoping you might look at my designs, maybe tell me if they're any good." She hesitated, then added, "Everyone says you're the best in the city, that your work is flawless." Juniper felt a rush of warmth. Her work had always been good, she'd known that, but to have someone seek her out specifically, to have built enough of a reputation that other craftspeople knew her name, that was new. "I'd be happy to look," she said, gesturing for Sarah to follow her to the sewing room. They spent the afternoon going through Sarah's designs, Juniper offering advice and criticism in equal measure. The girl had talent, real talent, but needed guidance on construction and fabric choice. When Lucien woke at sunset and found them there, surrounded by sketches and fabric samples, he leaned in the doorway and smiled. "You're going to start a school," he said, after Sarah had left, clutching a list of recommendations and Juniper's contact information. "What?" Juniper looked up from cleaning her workspace. "A school. For seamstresses and designers. You have the skill, and now you have the reputation. Plus," he added with a grin that showed just a hint of fang, "you have access to unlimited funding if you're willing to let me invest." The idea took root immediately, growing and expanding in her mind. She could teach others the skills her grandmother had taught her, could create opportunities for people like she'd been, struggling and invisible. "You'd really fund something like that?" "I'd fund anything that makes you happy," Lucien said, crossing the room to pull her into his arms. "Besides, it's a sound investment. Quality craftsmanship is rare. Supporting it benefits everyone." 6 months after that conversation, the Kane School of Textile Arts opened in a renovated building 3 blocks from Lucien's residence. Juniper taught classes 3 days a week, hired 2 other instructors for the remaining days, and offered scholarships to students who couldn't afford tuition. Word spread quickly, and within a year they had a waiting list. Lucien attended the 1-year anniversary celebration, standing in the back and watching with obvious pride as Juniper gave a speech about the importance of preserving traditional crafts. Afterward, when the guests had left and they were alone in the empty studio, he presented her with a box. Inside was a ring, white gold set with a deep red ruby that matched his eyes. "I know humans have traditions about these things," he said, dropping to one knee, despite the fact that he was a 300-year-old vampire king. "Proposals and ceremonies and public declarations. I can give you all of that if you want it, but mostly I just want to make official what's been true since the night you mended my cloak. You're mine, and I'm yours, for as long as you'll have me." Juniper's hands were shaking as she reached for the ring. "That's not very long compared to your lifespan." "Then we'll make every year count," Lucien said. "And when you're ready, when you've lived the human experiences you want to live, we can discuss the other options. But whatever you choose, however long we have, I want to spend it as your husband." "Yes," Juniper whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, of course, yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger and stood, pulling her into a kiss that was equal parts gentle and possessive, tender and fierce. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. "I've never been happier than I am with you. Never felt more complete. You took a torn cloak and made it whole, and somehow you did the same thing to me." The wedding was small, held at midnight in a garden behind Lucien's residence, attended by a strange mix of humans and supernatural creatures who'd become their friends and family. Juniper wore a dress she'd made herself, ivory silk with tiny seed pearls sewn into the bodice, and Lucien wore formal attire from another century that somehow looked perfect on him. Morrigan stood as a witness, her silver eyes suspiciously bright, and even a few of the older vampires who'd known Lucien for centuries admitted it was the first time they'd seen him truly smile. They honeymooned in Scotland, staying in an ancient castle that Lucien had owned for 200 years, spending their days exploring ruins and their nights wrapped in each other. Juniper learned what it meant to be loved by a vampire. The intensity, the possessiveness, the absolute focus and devotion. He couldn't give her warmth or sunlit breakfasts in bed, but he gave her everything else: protection, passion, partnership, and a love that felt eternal, even though she knew her mortal years were limited. "I've been thinking about what you said," Juniper told him one night as they lay together watching the stars through an open window. "About extending my life." Lucien went very still beside her. "And? I want to. Not full transformation. I don't think I could handle that, but the other option, the one that would give me more time with you." She turned to look at him, at his perfect pale face and ancient eyes. "I love you too much to only give you 50 or 60 years when I could give you centuries." "Are you certain?" His voice was careful, controlled, but she could see the hope blazing in his expression. "It's not a decision to make lightly. The process is painful, and there's no going back once it's done." "I'm certain," Juniper said firmly. "I want a lifetime with you, Lucien, a real lifetime, not just a human one." He kissed her then, deep and grateful and full of promises. "I'll arrange everything. We'll do it properly, with preparation and support, and afterward, when you're healed, we'll have all the time in the world." The ritual happened 2 months later, performed by a witch who specialized in life magic and attended by Morrigan and 2 other vampires Lucien trusted completely. It was agony. Liquid fire poured through Juniper's veins that made her scream until her voice gave out. But Lucien held her through all of it, his cool hands on her burning skin, his voice in her ear promising it would end, promising she'd survive, promising he'd be there when she woke. When consciousness finally returned, she felt different, stronger, sharper, more aware of everything around her. Her heartbeat was slower, her breathing more controlled, and when she looked in the mirror, her skin had taken on a faint luminescence, not quite the perfect white of a full vampire, but no longer entirely human either. "How do you feel?" Lucien asked, hovering anxiously by her side. Juniper tested her new body carefully, standing and walking across the room. Everything felt more vivid, colors brighter and sounds clearer. "I feel incredible. How long will I live like this?" 500 years, maybe more," Lucien said. "Long enough that we don't have to worry about time running out. Long enough to build a real future together." She turned to him, this vampire king who'd somehow become her entire world, and felt overwhelming gratitude for the night she'd chosen to mend his cloak without asking for payment. That single act of kindness had changed everything, had brought her love and purpose and a future she'd never imagined possible. "I love you," she said simply. "I love you too," Lucien replied, pulling her into his arms. "My queen, my wife, my Juniper." Years passed, flowing into decades. Juniper's school thrived and expanded, opening branches in 3 other cities, becoming renowned throughout the country for excellence in textile arts. She took on apprentices, taught workshops, and wrote books on technique that became standard references in the field. Her work was displayed in museums commissioned by wealthy collectors, and she never forgot the struggling seamstress she'd been, always offering help to those just starting out. Lucien ruled his territory with strength tempered by the compassion Juniper had taught him, and together they became known as fair but formidable. Vampires who caused problems were dealt with swiftly, but those who lived peacefully were left alone. Humans under their protection thrived, and gradually the fear that had always existed between the species began to ease, replaced by cautious cooperation. On their 50th wedding anniversary, they returned to the street corner where they'd first met. The laundromat was gone, replaced by a cafe, and the city had changed dramatically, but Juniper could still picture her rickety sewing table, still remember the terror and fascination she'd felt when a white-haired vampire had stepped from the shadows. "Do you ever regret it?" Lucien asked, his arm around her waist. "Agreeing to mend that cloak, letting me into your life, choosing this path?" Juniper looked up at him, at the face she'd loved for 50 years and would love for centuries more. "Never. Not for a single moment. You gave me everything, Lucien. Love, purpose, a future I never dreamed possible, all because I was too stubborn to charge you money." He laughed, the sound rich and warm. "Best decision you ever made." "Best decision we both made," Juniper corrected. She stood on her toes to kiss him, right there on the street corner where everything had begun. You could have gone anywhere for repairs, but you came to me. You could have ignored my refusal to charge you, but you remembered. You could have walked away and never looked back, but you stayed. You protected me, pursued me, loved me when I was just a struggling seamstress with nothing to offer. You had everything to offer, Lucien said fiercely. Kindness, strength, beauty, talent. You were extraordinary then, and you're extraordinary now. I'm the one who's lucky you chose me. They stood there for a long time, holding each other as the city moved around them, two immortal beings born from a simple act of generosity. The cloak Juniper had mended still hung in their home, preserved and protected, a reminder of where they'd started. Lucien had kept his word. In 50 years, he'd never worn another craftsperson's work. Every piece of clothing he owned had been made by Juniper's hands, stitched with the same care and precision she'd shown that very first night. As the sun set and stars began appearing in the darkening sky, they walked home together, hand in hand, ready for whatever the next century might bring. They'd built something real and lasting, not just a marriage but a partnership, a life crafted as carefully as Juniper's finest seams, strong enough to weather any storm. The poor seamstress who'd mended a vampire king's torn cloak for free had gained everything that mattered, love, purpose, and time enough to enjoy them both. And the vampire king who'd never believed he could feel truly human again had found his humanity reflected in the eyes of a woman brave enough to show him kindness when she had nothing else to give. In the end, it was the best trade either of them had ever made, a cloak mended without payment, exchanged for a love that would last far beyond the limits of mortal time. They'd found each other in the darkness of a city night, two lonely souls seeking connection, and together they'd built something bright enough to light up centuries. Years continued to unfold, bringing changes and challenges that they faced together with the united strength that had become their hallmark. Juniper's extended lifespan meant she could be more than just Lucien's wife. She became his true partner in ruling, respected by vampires and humans alike for her wisdom and fairness. The school grew into an institution, then a legacy. Juniper's former students opened their own businesses, taught their own apprentices, spreading quality craftsmanship across the country and eventually the world. Some of them knew the truth about what she was, about the vampire king she'd married, and they kept her secret faithfully, grateful for the opportunities she'd given them. On their 100th anniversary, Morrigan organized a celebration that filled Lucien's residence with supernatural creatures and humans who'd become family over the decades. There were vampires Lucien had known for centuries, witches who'd helped with Juniper's transformation, humans who'd studied at her school, and even a few werewolves from the northern territories who'd become allies through careful diplomacy. Juniper stood in the center of the great hall, wearing a gown she'd designed specifically for this occasion, midnight blue silk that shimmered with silver thread in patterns that mimicked constellations. Lucien stood beside her in the cloak she'd mended a century before, still perfectly intact, still his most prized possession. 100 years, Morrigan said, raising a glass in toast. I never thought I'd see Lord Gravesend smile as much as he has in the past century. Here's to the seamstress who mended more than just a cloak, who mended a king's heart and brought warmth to those of us who'd forgotten what warmth felt like. The gathered crowd cheered and drank, and Juniper felt tears prick her eyes. These people, this strange, beautiful family they'd built from nothing, meant everything to her. She'd come so far from the lonely, struggling woman she'd been, and yet she'd never forgotten where she started, never lost touch with the core of kindness that had drawn Lucien to her in the first place. Later, when the party had wound down and they were alone in their chambers, Lucien pulled her close and whispered, "Thank you." "For what?" Juniper asked, though she thought she knew. "For choosing me, for staying with me, for building this life with me. I was so alone before you, Juniper. I had power and respect and wealth, but I was hollow inside. You filled that emptiness with love and light and purpose. You made me remember why immortality could be a gift instead of a curse." Juniper cupped his face in her hands, looking into those wine-dark eyes she'd loved for 100 years. "You did the same for me. I was invisible before you saw me. I was surviving, not living. You gave me everything: adventure, security, love, and time enough to make a real difference in the world. We saved each other, Lucien. That's what makes us work." He kissed her then, and even after a century together, The touch of his lips still sent shivers down her spine, still made her heart race with anticipation. They made love slowly, tenderly, with the comfortable intimacy of two people who knew each other completely and loved what they found. Afterward, wrapped in silk sheets, Lucien traced the barely visible scars on Juniper's wrist from the transformation ritual. "Do you ever miss it? Being fully human?" She considered the question seriously, as she always did when he asked. He had asked it every decade, making sure she didn't regret her choice. "No," she said honestly. "I miss my grandmother sometimes, wish she could have met you and seen what I've built. But being human? No, this is better. I have time to perfect my craft, to really make an impact, to love you the way you deserve to be loved. I wouldn't trade that for anything." "Good," Lucien said, pulling her closer, "because I'm never letting you go." Juniper smiled against his chest. "Possessive vampire." "You're possessive vampire," he corrected, and she could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "Always," she agreed. The centuries stretched before them, full of possibility and promise. They would face challenges. Certainly, vampire politics never stopped being complicated, and the world was always changing. But they would face them together, the seamstress and the king, bound by love that had started with a simple act of kindness and grown into something eternal. In the residence's main hall, the cloak hung in a place of honor, protected in a climate-controlled case that would preserve it for millennia. Visitors often asked about it, this seemingly ordinary piece of clothing that occupied such prominence in a vampire king's home. Lucien always told them the same story. It was mended by the woman he loved, stitched with such care and skill that it became perfect, irreplaceable, priceless. He never wore another craftsperson's work because nothing could compare to what Juniper created, and more importantly, because that cloak represented the moment his life had changed forever. It was a reminder that kindness mattered, that small acts of generosity could have profound consequences, that sometimes the most powerful magic in the world wasn't supernatural at all. It was simply one person choosing to help another, expecting nothing in return. Juniper would sometimes stand in front of the case late at night, studying her century-old stitches, marveling at how something so small had led to something so large. A torn cloak, a free repair, and suddenly her entire world had shifted, bringing her love and purpose and a future that would stretch far beyond any normal human lifespan. She'd been poor and alone and invisible, and now she was wealthy and loved and renowned. She'd transformed from a struggling seamstress into a teacher, an artist, a queen in all but title. And it had all started because she'd chosen kindness over profit, generosity over survival. As she stood there, Lucien appeared behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. They looked at the cloak together, this artifact of their shared history, and didn't need to speak. They both understood what it represented, the foundation of everything they'd built, the proof that good things could come from genuine compassion, the symbol of a love that had defied expectations and grown stronger with each passing year. "I love you," Juniper said softly. "I love you too," Lucien replied. "Thank you for mending my cloak, my darling seamstress. Thank you for mending me." They stood there in comfortable silence, two immortal beings whose love had been forged in darkness and kindness, strengthened by time and trust, and would endure for centuries to come. The poor seamstress had mended the vampire king's torn cloak for free, and in return he'd given her the world and his heart, which was worth infinitely more. Outside, the city slept, unaware of the love story that had unfolded in its shadows, the tale of kindness rewarded and loneliness vanquished. Inside, surrounded by art and history and the life they'd built together, Juniper and Lucien held each other and looked toward a future that promised endless tomorrows, all of them spent side by side. The cloak remained pristine, the stitches as tight and precise as the day they were made, a testament to skill and care that transcended time. And every night when Lucien wore it, draping it across his shoulders before heading out into the world, he felt the love woven into every fiber, the kindness that had started everything, the moment when a struggling seamstress had looked at a vampire king and seen only someone who needed help. That was the real magic, the true power that had changed both their lives, not transformation rituals or supernatural abilities, but simple human and inhuman compassion, offered freely and accepted gratefully, growing into a love that would last as long as the stars themselves. Their story became legend in supernatural circles, told and retold as an example of what could happen when kindness bridged the gap between different worlds. The vampire king and the human seamstress, united by a torn cloak and genuine affection, proving that love could thrive even in the most unlikely circumstances. And somewhere in Lucien's vast collection of memories, preserved with perfect immortal clarity, was the image of Juniper as she'd been that first night, tired and brave and kind, standing under a street lamp with his torn cloak in her hands, refusing payment, because the work itself mattered more than the money. That was the moment he'd begun falling in love, though he hadn't recognized it at the time. That was when everything had changed. Now, 100 years later, with centuries still ahead of them, Lucien Gravesend, Vampire King, understood that he'd been given something infinitely precious that night, not just expert craftsmanship, though Juniper's skill was undeniable, but hope. Hope that he could be more than a monster, that he could be loved for who he was rather than what he represented, that his immortal existence could have meaning beyond power and politics. Juniper Kane, once a poor seamstress struggling to survive, had found her own hope reflected in wine, dark eyes, and protective devotion. She discovered that she was worth protecting, worth pursuing, worth loving with an intensity that spanned centuries. She'd learned that her skills had value beyond mere survival, that her kindness could change lives, that she was extraordinary in ways she'd never imagined. Together, they were complete. Together, they were home. And it had all started with a simple choice: to mend a torn cloak for free, expecting nothing in return, offering help because it was the right thing to do. That choice had rippled outward, creating waves that transformed 2 lives and touched countless others, proving that even small acts of goodness could have profound and lasting impact. The Vampire King never wore another's work again, not because he was dismissive of other craftspeople's skills, but because every thread Juniper stitched carried her love, her care, her essence. Wearing her creations meant carrying her with him always, feeling her touch even when they were apart, being reminded constantly of how lucky he was to have found her. And Juniper, surrounded by the life they'd built and the centuries stretching ahead, never regretted the night she'd said yes to mending a stranger's cloak, yes to accepting his protection, yes to loving him despite the danger and impossibility. She'd chosen love over fear, and that choice had made all the difference. As dawn approached and Lucien needed to retreat from the coming sun, they walked together to their chambers, hands intertwined, completely content. They had survived threats and challenges, had built an empire of love and respect, had proven that different worlds could unite when genuine affection bridged the gap. The cloak hung in its case, a silent witness to everything they'd become, and would continue hanging there for centuries to come, a reminder of where they'd started and how far they'd traveled together. The poor seamstress and the vampire king, bound by thread and blood and love, facing eternity side by side. And somewhere in the darkness before dawn, as Juniper curled against Lucien's cool body and felt his arms tighten around her protectively, she smiled. This was home. This was love. This was the life she'd never dared dream of, gifted to her by a vampire who'd valued kindness above wealth, who'd chosen her when she had nothing to offer but skilled hands and a generous heart. "Sweet dreams," Lucien whispered, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I'm already living them," Juniper replied, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The story that had begun with a torn cloak and a free repair had become an epic spanning centuries, a love that defied death and time, a partnership that changed both the human and supernatural worlds for the better. And at its heart was a truth both simple and profound. Kindness matters, love endures, and sometimes the most unlikely meetings lead to the most extraordinary futures. The poor seamstress had mended the Vampire King's torn cloak for free, and in doing so had mended both their hearts, creating something beautiful and lasting and infinitely precious. He never wore another's work again, because hers carried magic no supernatural being could replicate, the magic of love freely given, of devotion earned through mutual respect, of 2 souls finding each other in the darkness and choosing to walk into the light together. And they lived happily, peacefully, passionately, for centuries upon centuries, proof that true love could transcend any boundary, overcome any obstacle, and create joy that lasted longer than empires, stronger than time itself. The Vampire King and his Seamstress Queen, ruling with wisdom and grace, loving with intensity and tenderness, building a legacy that would inspire others for generations to come. Their story was complete, their love eternal, their happiness well-earned and deeply felt. And it all traced back to a single choice made on a dark street corner, when a struggling seamstress had looked at a vampire king and chosen kindness over profit, generosity over self-interest, connection over fear. That choice had changed everything, and neither of them would ever regret it.